Hello and welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our live stream. Today's topic is multi cloud security, balancing flexibility and protection. I'm your host, Peter Van Rysdam, head of marketing here at Cloud Institute. And if you're not familiar with Cloud Institute, we are a training and coaching company that equips IT teams to confidently deliver on IT projects. We offer personalized coaching with cloud experts and hands on project based training to help you with those live projects. All right, I'm happy to introduce today one of those experts, Zaki Medina. Zaki is an expert instructor and cloud coach who has coached thousands of aspiring data scientists and engineers. Before I turn it over to Zaki, I want to encourage you all to ask questions in the comments, and we'll answer them at the end of the presentation. Also, this recording will be available here on this LinkedIn event page immediately afterwards. We'll get it on YouTube as well. And also, if you'd like a copy of the slide deck, leave a comment and I'll connect with you and get that over to you. So we'll try to keep this right at about 30 minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Zaki. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Peter, for the great introduction. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever you may be today. I'm Zaki Medina. I will be your host today. And today we have a really great topic. I would say it's about multi-cloud and security control. You know, some of you understand security control as secure ops or SecOps, right? We know that public clouds are likely the most best secure platforms in the world, right? Because everybody's bringing their their workloads there, including high risk, organizations with high security footprints like banks and government and public institutions. So, but the thing about multi-cloud is that they only provide you with tools, right? Ultimately, the responsibility to define and determine those security controls or what security controls should be in place really lies with the enterprise or with us, right, as sort of the practitioners and providers of that, right? So really the session today is really looking at from a design and implementation guidance perspective, what are some of the security controls around security policies, and then within that security policies, obviously we look at multi-cloud, and then we sort of look at how those examples would be in within Azure, AWS, GCP, and and then taking that one step further into sort of how the identity and access management works out, right? And there's a concept of identity where we use a central identity store, which can be used for various different privilege level access. And we'll look at some examples of that leveraging AWS and GCP. Again, I was joking with Peter earlier that this could really be a half a day or even a day long session, but we'll try to keep the nebulous topic with 30 minutes and try to get every question answered as well towards the end. So, again, a little bit about me. I've been working on cloud for a while, probably last 17 years. I currently manage a bunch of environments, both GCP, Azure, and AWS. So feel free to ask questions alongside those. So let's get started. Um, One thing to note, whatever we do in the cloud is needs to be secure, right? And as I mentioned, cloud providers only provide tools. How do we define to use these tools? We need to start thinking about the assets that we want to protect and how we want to protect them. And there's a number of security baselines, but the one that I always use and the one that's always recommended by my peers in the cybersecurity space is around Center for Internet Security, right? CIS. Now, we're not going to really dive into what the security framework is. For a lot of you folks that have actually done any course in AWS, GCP, or Azure, and we had a webinar last week on security certifications, and this is really the first chapter you cover, right? CIA, right? We're not talking about the other one, but just you know how we go about looking at all the various the foundation of our security policies, right? So CIA is considered a principle, right? You have confidentiality, where we talk about the assets in our IT environment must be protected from unauthorized access at all times. Then we have integrity, right? Which is assets in the IT environment must be protected from changes that are not specified and unauthorized. And then we have sort of availability, right? And what this availability is, these are assets in the IT environment that must be accessible by authorized users, right? I often say that security is really a balancing act if you think about it, right? Like too much security means you really lock it down. It's not easy to use, it's not easy. So and then not enough security means anyone can get in, right? So that's sort of the spectrum. So, obviously we're jumping in here. What I'd like you to think that as companies move to cloud environments, whether it be infrastructure as a service, IaaS, platform as a service, PaaS, and software as a service. So, these solutions, they're secured intrinsically by default, but like and Azure, AWS, GCP are probably the best secured platforms in the world. But one thing to think about is, there's an element where the security policy itself has nothing to do with technology. Means the policy merely defines the security principles and how they're safeguarded within the organization, right? The policy does not define what ports must be open in a firewall or what type of firewall is required. The policy describes the requirement that assets belonging to a certain function in the enterprise must be protected at a certain level. Maybe we have a business critical function today, right? Like maybe it's our CRM and our customer database or sales database where we're looking at transactions, right? And so on. So that's business critical, right? How do we protect that? Obviously, data loss must be kept to a zero in that circumstance. So that's where the right type of architectural design will come in to ensure that we have continuous backups, we have disaster recovery options, we have very strict authorization, authentication, and so on. So oftentimes we want to make sure the people that are able to access these systems can access these systems, right? Now, some of you may think, oh, I've heard about security frameworks. Great, because there are a ton of those security frameworks, depending on the type of industry, public setting, or framework that you operate in. I personally work in healthcare, so I'm always looking at the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA. I'm also have an e-commerce associated with that, so payment card industry, PCI, is another data standard, security standard that we follow, right? And so again, as a cloud architect, as a cloud practitioner, a security practitioner, a deep understanding of these frameworks and how they define these systems must be defined, right? A lot of these standards actually come from the ISO, right? International Organization of Standardization on ISO, and the US National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, right? So between these two, we kind of have this framework of CIS, right? And so cloud providers have actually all adopted this CIS or CIS framework in a benchmark for their platform. So you can actually find documentation on how CIS maps to, all their different frameworks. I would say there's really two basic levels of CIS controls. There's your essential security requirements that will not impact the functionality of the workloads of service. Then there's the recommended settings for the environment, right? So for that require greater security that may impact your workloads or services through reduced functionality, right? So again, in summary, CIS really just provides a security framework based on the best practices, right? And so some of the things that they cover, right, is things like identity and access management, storage accounts, database services, logging and monitoring, networking, virtual machines, application services, and so on. So now that I've got an understanding of security policies, how do I define this baseline of security policies, right? Now, it's really simple to get started in the cloud today. I get it. A few mouse clicks, our server is up and running in the cloud platform. But in an enterprise, it could be a little more complicated, a little more extra hoops we have to jump through. Because guess what? We might be migrating or creating systems in the cloud. And maybe we need to understand how to architect all of this. Obviously, security is a high priority. I would say the two things in the cloud is is controlling costs in the cloud as well as security. These are the two big top of mind items, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're building IaaS or PaaS or SaaS solutions, regardless, as your environment grows, your cloud environment grows, complexity goes, right? We enter the system of systems complexity. So basically, every service that's enrolled or every workload that's enrolled in our cloud environment, we need to consider how best to secure each of these services, right? So what are some of the steps in creating these policies, right? Let's start with checking regulations, right? So we get it. Every company I mentioned, I work in healthcare, so I have HIPAA and PCI regulations. So every company is subject to these regulations, right? So understanding what those are, that's a great starting point. And then all the major platforms, Azure, AWS, GCP, are actually compliant with all of these leading compliance and security frameworks. They make this open and available to them. So talk to your account rep from these if you're using any of these cloud vendors, even if they're not Azure, AWS, GCP, whoever other provider, they will definitely have those controls in place. Or maybe you're selecting those, you should definitely have that conversation. So one thing to note here with SaaS applications, right? The provider controls the full stack. So operating system, hardware, network infrastructure, application upgrades, patches, it's all on the hook responsibility under the provider, right? So that's something that you'll have to think of. If you are a company offering a SaaS application or a SaaS tool or something to the broader market, to your end users or customers, you have to think about that. Next up is restricting access. This is often you hear the term zero trust. This is more around, and that term is really more related to network segmentation, but zero trust is really tightly connected to access management. We will have to design a clear RBAC, or role-based access control model, where users have specific roles, they're granting authorization to execute certain actions in the cloud environment. And if they don't have the appropriate role or right authorization, guess what? They will not be able to execute actions other than the ones that they've been explicitly assigned, right? So one term that is really important in this context, you'll hear this is kind of a buzzword, is least privilege, right? Just give enough access, right? This is Goldilocks approach, just enough, right? So users only get the role and associated authorizations to perform the minimum number of actions that are really required for their daily job and nothing more, right? Oftentimes you'll have to bring in other folks to come in and determine that in your organization for your specific users. And number three, secure connections, right? Obviously, cloud environments, they're all in the internet, which is a great big WAN, right? Wide area network. And so how that traffic or that net comes in, we have to make sure that those connections are secure and they're allowed and they're monitored. We need to know what kind of protocols are being allowed. Are these connections encrypted? Also, how is the cloud tenant segmented, right? Like, do we need to ensure there's some level of tenant communication or not, or block those, right? So your security baseline should really contain strict policies for all the different types of connectivity, whether it's a direct connection via VPN, in transit encryption, traffic scanning, network component monitoring. Again, when you think about zero trust principle, network segmentation is really key and crucial, right? So whatever the architecture that is designed, users can simply hop from one segment of the environment or network to another, right? So segments must be contained and the workloads inside those segments must be protected. So a zero trust architecture is what's highly recommended. It typically defines zones, and within these zones, whether it's a private zone or a public zone, or like for instance, a private zone is where only inbound traffic is allowed, whereas a public zone is where there's connections to the outside world, right? So those zones are strictly separated from each other by means of a variety of security elements like firewalls, security groups, or access control lists. So something to consider as you're building this. And then obviously protect the perimeter, right? We all have a door in our house, in our home. So it's the same thing for the cloud. So this is you're protecting, the outside world of the cloud from the cloud in your cloud environment, right? So that boundary, right? That boundary is where the connections terminate into your cloud environment. This can be a hub. There's also gateways, proxy servers, and firewalls that are all hosted here. Again, you could even, host a bastion host, or jump server as a single point of entry where a user is allowed to gain access to the workloads in the environment. So that's something that's key. Whenever you watch those, any TV show or movie where there's a, proverbial hacker going in, and the first thing that comes up on his screen, guess what? That's most likely a jump server, if that's legitimate, if they're trying to mimic real life. Um, then number five is sort of protect the inside, meaning even once you're inside, there are workloads, right? There's servers, applications, containers, various other things. There has to be some level of boundary protection with gateways and firewalls, right? We want to protect our workloads, right? And make sure these workloads are hardened, that we reduce any vulnerability of the systems by ensuring we've got the mandatory applied security settings, such as removing software components, that are unnecessary or disabling services that are not required to run on the system, right? And last but not least is, doing frequent audits, right? This is this step that really falls within managing security policies, which will be covered sort of towards the end. But security policies need to be constantly assessed. Why? Because guess what? Security is constantly evolving. There are new tools by bad guys that are constantly coming up. AI has only exacerbated that. So security policies need to be constantly assessed. Hackers don't sit on their heads and will constantly think of ways to look for vulnerabilities. Therefore, it's necessary to continuously assess and audit those policies and evaluate, identified vulnerabilities, right, and so on. So those are some of the things that we want to look at. Um, and part of this security scope, you could say, is there is a there's this concept. When you think about security, you can think about a giant onion which has many layers, and within those layers, right, there's a model called the defense in depth, where it's basically you can think of it as a construct or a common methodology in designing your security architectures, and that could even go for the cloud. Each layer really comprises of a protective measures, and then if you break through that first layer, then then there's another layer that there's also will be protection at that layer, and so on and so forth. So this prevents attackers from really compromising everything all the way down, right? Obviously data is what you want to protect, so all of these layers, this defense in depth, is really critical. I'm only highlighting a few of these common ones, right? You may see defense in depth models that are 5 layers, 6 layers, 10 layers, 12 layers deep. you know Regardless, they will all have these common things in place. You'll have a network layer, right? As stated, network is sort of the entrance in our cloud environment, right? And they have to be protected. Technologies to protect the network are firewalls, intrusion detection systems, intrusion prevention systems, right? And even public key infrastructure, as well as network segmentation, right? All preferably adhering to some level of zero trust, uh, principles and or our architectural guidelines, and so on. Then we have our platform layer, right? This is the layer. You could say this is the layer of our operating system, right, where the system should be fully patched with the latest fixes for any possible vulnerabilities, and they're also hardened, right? So we all need to pay attention to ports that are opened on any system, especially on public zones, and any port that's not required should be disabled by default, right? That's kind of a given. Firewalls by nature have an implicit disabled. Uh, then we have sort of our application layer, right? Now, the application layer, this is a layer not only about the application, but also about the middleware and APIs that are communicating directly with our application. So the application code must be secured, right? So the static code analysis can be very helpful and is strongly advised. There are static program analysis tools out there that can basically execute software. You can validate the integrity of your source code and so on. So any attempt to change the code or software parameters is detected automatically, and you get a notification sent, right? And finally, we have sort of data layer, right? I would not say finally, but this is the holy grail for any attacker coming in, right? If an attacker succeeds to get through your first 3 layers, network, platform, and application, obviously the next is the data itself. Now, not going much into data security, as we would end up running out of time, but maybe if you put a note in here, if you're interested in the data security, defining what those are, very interested in that. But this is the layer in which you need to ensure that data is encrypted in both transit and at rest. That's sort of the big thing for us, right? So example for transit would be TLS encryption, SSL, and then at rest could be obviously you're hardening the actual disk on which it's residing in, or encrypting the disk that it's residing in. Sorry, and then finally our response layer. Now this is the layer, I would call it the security monitoring layer, where you may have a security information and event management CM tool. And this is the layer where all suspicious activity is being captured, analyzed, and translated into triggers and executing any kind of mitigating actions, right? And so on. So this is sort of the big area. Again, a lot of this, if you jump in and look at all of this stuff, right? Like some of the best practices that we think about within security policies, for instance, for access, would be, only use named accounts to allow access to systems. Be extremely selective when granting global admin rights. You want to implement role-based access and use multi-factor authentication where possible, and we'll talk a bit about that in our IAM section coming up. Then we have our perimeter or boundary protection. You want to implement firewalls or use native firewalls from the cloud platforms, or any kind of recommended practice to have firewalls set to block all as default and only open up ports as you need them. Then you have your PKI or public key infrastructure. Again, you have both public and private keys that verify the identity of the user before the data is transferred. So any kind of breach passwords are still number one root cause for compromised systems and data leaks. Therefore, it's recommended not to use passwords, but instead use keys. Securely store those in a key vault. All major cloud providers, they provide PKI services and key vault solutions. So, definitely leverage those. And finally, make sure that we have whatever happens in our cloud environment, we track at all times. Even with the most rigid security policy, a company should never fully rely on security measures alone. Monitoring and an audit trail are highly recommended. And required in some cases as best practices. So this is sort of our baseline of security policies. If we jump into sort of the vendor specific side, right? Before I jump in, I want to just talk a bit about, when you've looked at different security and compliance frameworks, God, man, I've worked in so many industries. Everything has an example of that. But the CIS benchmark, right? Because CIS is very widely and globally adopted as a baseline for security policies. It has benchmarks set for each type of platform. And we're going to look at a few of these, right? So Azure Security Center is a native service within Azure. In other words, you don't need to install or configure anything from the Azure console. Security Center can be accessed almost immediately by enabling Azure, and then it starts monitoring all your workloads by default that you've deployed, whether it be virtual machines, your databases, your storage accounts, your networking components, anything else. So these policies can be configured in Security Center. Now, CIS lists some recommendations specific to Azure Security Center. Probably the most important one is to activate the standard pricing tier, because this really enables threat detection for all your networks and VMs in your Azure tenant. And it recommends, to implement a policy that comes with an explanation, right? And so on. So a lot of this, all of this, like Microsoft has this, allows for greater defense in depth. With threat detection, they have their Microsoft Security Response Center, MSRS. If you guys want to Google that, that's just their center where all the threats come in, and they inform everyone. They make changes on Azure cloud and the back end. Again, with Security Center, it's available right off when you log into Azure for the first time on the portal.azure.com site. We have a screenshot here as an example, and it kind of gives you a security score here, right? The next action is obviously to enable a monitoring agent to actually collect the data, and make sure that there's their default setting and all of those things are set up. Again, we're just providing a list of some of the security settings, right? Ensure that you have vulnerabilities are being scanned, you enforce endpoint protection. I won't go through all of these because it's exhaustive, but you know, there are a few of these that are high level. And for those high level alerts, make sure you have email and SMS text messaging also set up. So Azure also has another product, just like Security Center. It's called Azure Sentinel. It's a native CM solution for Azure. It's an intelligent defense in depth. So if you ever want to look at that, check it out. Um, Same thing goes for AWS. AWS, all these guys offer the same thing. I'm just covering this for brevity here. With AWS, they too have a single security dashboard with AWS Security Hub. Again, it aggregates monitoring alerts from all the various security solutions like CloudWatch and CloudTrail. It also collects findings from Amazon Guard Duty, Amazon Inspector, Amazon Macie, and then Amazon IAM, Access Analyzer, and Firewall Manager, and CloudTrail. One key element of is CloudTrail. Some of you is really popular. It monitors the compliance of your accounts in AWS. So does some level of operational auditing and so on. You can say that CloudTrail is sort of the engine underneath Security Hub, and so on. So there's a couple of things that you want to note here. I would say you know when you look at the lower half of the screen, you'll see there's a bunch of, on the left side, there's guard duty, right? This is Amazon solution for threat detection. There's Inspector. This is a tool that assesses applications for exposure and vulnerabilities. You have Macie, which monitors data security and data privacy of your data stored in Amazon S3 storage. You have IAM Access Analyzer. This helps track accounts accessing environments in AWS. And then you have Firewall Manager. This basically enables centralized management of all your firewalls in AWS. So by clicking sort of the Enable Security Hub button, as mentioned, all with the CIS basically, you enable everything, right? Like so there's a and what I've listed here is sort of a list. These are the CIS baselines specific to AWS, right? Won't go through all of them, but again, these are not all the settings, but they're most of the important ones for getting the logging and monitoring, right? Um, and then we jump into Google, which has the same level, right? Google has their security command center and so on. So again, all of these have the same kind of story, you could say. And the goal here is to provide this as reference material. But I wanted to just bring this up because it's really key for us to understand, right, as we go through this. Um, Next up is with identity and access management. I would say this is the number one. Why? Because a lot of the cloud service providers will look after everything, but IAM or identity and access management is really on the customer side, on the end user side, right? So when you think of RBAC, right, it's very important. We have provide role-based access control for our cloud environments, and part of RBAC is establishing who gets what access, right? And we're following the principle of least privilege, as I mentioned. And then there are concepts like single sign-on, SSO, multi-factor authentication, MFA, and even privileged access management, PAM. We can go into these are something that we've always talked about, but from a large part of all the three layers, the principle of least privilege must be followed for maximum protection, right? For all of these systems. Primarily, the whole thing around IAM is to control your identities and therefore what directory you control these in, right? And that directory is really key. And so we're going to jump in when we talk about directory. Before we get into Active Directory itself, again, I don't want to confuse it with Azure Active Directory. The latter is an authentication service in Azure, whereas Active Directory really is just a directory, right? So understanding Active Directory is not easy, but it gives you sort of like, you have a central repository of your identity that you store, everything in. So within that conversation, right, you'll have your domain controllers that want to make sure your domain controllers are part of the public cloud and they're working with it. And within that domain controller, you'll have a federation service. What the federation service does is it federates the domain in the cloud with the directory that your enterprise is already using. And as an example, we're showing here my company as an X. And then this is sort of an on-premise model. But as we move to the cloud, you want to federate with that on-premise AD, right? So whenever you move in cloud migrations, the first step is to get all the identities IAM already federated with the cloud IAM solution, and then we run it from there. And so as we run it from the cloud, as we're designing this for multi-cloud, right? So let's assume that Azure, we're using the Azure Active Directory, and then again AAD for Azure Active Directory. We want to enable account federation in multi-cloud. That's actually a feature. And then once you do that, you can leverage any kind of SaaS application like Office 365 or Google Workspace and so on. So this kind of federation services is really key. The good news is that this federation works the same way as it does in AWS and GCP. In AWS, you want to enable ADFS and a component of that. Azure has something called the AWS Federated Authentication Services, and so with ADFS, that's what it stands for. You basically, a user is authenticated against the central identity store or Active Directory, and then after authentication, ADFS or it returns a statement that permits the logging into AWS, and it uses something called an AWS Security Token Service (STS), and that gives you temporary control and which allows you access to the AWS Management Console, and that's what this diagram is showing you, and so on. So then the similar approach also works for Google. Google has also enabled this, SAML to do AD for Active Directory Federation. So it starts with the Google Cloud Identity, and that service uses IAM. And Google understands that enterprise already have these stores, and they'll run it through and so on. So this is kind of the high level of IAM. Uh, so just a quick recap: we looked at security policies, we looked at different security policies, we looked at CIA and CIS and how the different baseline of policies could be created. Some of the things we want to look at. We looked at how it works in AWS, Azure, and GCP, and then we looked at IAM, how IAM leverages a single centralized database or Active Directory for that identity of the user, and then that can be federated with multiple different clouds or multi-cloud environments, and so on, and how the token exchange goes on, and so on. So that's sort of our big chapter on multi-cloud security. Any questions on that? I know we're running a little over time.
Yeah, we did have just a couple questions here, so we'll try to get to those. So the first one up is from Grace, who asks, are there certain cloud providers that make multi-cloud easier than others?
Well, I use the example of Azure. I would say Azure is the easiest one because Azure has the most footprint. I mean, all of them are easy. I mean, they all use the same principles. But if you ask for common, meaning the one that has the most information and most troubleshooting tips and things, I would say Azure. And then second is AWS, and then so on.
All right, and probably have time for one more, so let's just get this last one in. Who should manage security policies within an organization?
That's a great question. I would say the first level of people that are concerned is sort of the people at the top that are looking at security as, you have your chief information security officer, CISO, or your chief information officer, CIO. They set the directions for security policies and make sure the business is compliant. And the CISO or CIO is also responsible. And then level two comes down to, the folks in the IT side, security engineers, and so on. That have to execute on this, right? They're the ones who are implementing the rule sets within Azure Security Center, within AWS Security Hub, and Google Security Command Center, and they know what to do when there's an event or an alert being raised in those systems.
Perfect. All right. I think that's probably all we have time for at the moment. But if you do have more questions, go ahead and just send them in on LinkedIn, and we'll try to get to them after the fact. Want to let you know about a couple of things. So we have security training content for all of those major cloud platforms, Zaki mentioned, like Microsoft Certified Azure Fundamentals and Administrator. That course includes labs and one-on-one coaching for only $98, which is pretty impressive. And I will drop a link to that one down here in the chat. But there's even a better option too. If you subscribe to our monthly or annual coaching, you'll also get access to all the training and labs at no additional cost. So you'd have the Azure, GCP, AWS, all of that. Coaching starts at just $64 a month. So that's really the way to go if you're serious about advancing your cloud career. So I'll drop those here in the chat as Zaki has any final thoughts for us here.
No, I think the coaching aspect is huge, as you can tell. The information, I myself am a cloud coach and participate in this with my other peers, is you want to get information today. A lot of the information out there is just regurgitated and is not current, right? Some of you may even use ChatGPT to get your information. Know that it's 2, 3 years old, so you're not getting the latest. But a cloud coach, someone who's involved every day working with, can give you a quick 30 minutes could end up changing your all your weeks of research and things. So do look at it, give it a try. My policy is leave no rock unturned as you go into your journey, whether it be a certification journey or you're looking at something within your own organization to deploy some advanced cloud features. So I'll pass it off to you, Peter.
All right, sounds good. And please send us a message if you'd like to be notified of our upcoming events. Zaki will be hosting several more free trainings over the coming months. Moving forward for the rest of this month, we're going to focus a little bit on cloud automation. So that will be fun. We have our next event June 14th. So that's next Wednesday at noon Eastern. We'll be talking about kickstarting your cloud automation venture, your gateway to efficiency. So we hope you can join us for that. And thank you all for attending today, and we hope to see you next week.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.